Hello, welcome to Chapter 5. We're studying our new unit now where we're looking at the birth of the United States as a nation. This chapter will be a precursor to the American Revolution, which is Chapter 6, and then Chapter 7 will dive deeper into the Constitution and our founding papers. So let's look at Section 1. What we're going to look at today in the notes is the French and Indian War, an event in North America from roughly 1750 to 1763. It was a series of little wars in North America that was part of what many historians call the First World War, since France and England were fighting each other all around the globe for colonies. Our questions for this chapter, we have several. How did this rivalry lead to the war between Britain and France? And how did the lack of unity and mistakes lead to British defeats early in the war? Early on, it looked like they weren't going to win. Who and what turned the tide? And how did British troops bring about the fall of New France? So let's look first at why there was a rivalry. They were competing for trade and colonies all around the globe, France and England. And they both claimed land in North America that was right next to each other. What today you would call Canada and we would call the United States. Canada was primarily French. The United States was primarily British. But the dispute was in the Ohio River Valley. British settlers were pushing into the Ohio River Valley, and they were clashing with French fur traders who lived there and wanted to keep the British out to control the trade for themselves. Now, Native Americans were caught in the middle of this, so they chose sides. The Algonquins and the Hurons fought with the French, whereas the Iroquois fought with the British. And those names sound somewhat familiar. We learned about them earlier in Unit 1 at the start of the school year. And in 1754, France and Great Britain began to fight for real in the Ohio River Valley. English settlers were called to fight against France and their Indian allies and the French in Indian War, which is what we called it in North America. Now, early on, the British were making a lot of mistakes and having a bad time. First problem, the Albany Plan of Union. This was proposed by Benjamin Franklin as a way to get the colonists to organize themselves to work together to defeat the French, that they would make up a general government of the 13 colonies. Well, that didn't go over well because the colonial assemblies refused to give up any of their power, so they turned it down. So that would have been helpful to win the war if they had been unified in who they were fighting against. So that's strike one. Fort necessity. This is when George Washington enters our nation's history as a person of note. He was the commander at Fort Necessity, where he launched a surprise attack against the French. And he was defeated and forced to surrender. And many historians would say this was the beginning of the French and Indian War, that George Washington started the war while he was a commander in the Virginia militia. And Fort Duquesne, which is how you say this funky word, Duquesne. General Braddock, the British general, took his troops towards Fort Duquesne, which is basically what today we call Pittsburgh. And along the way, he was ambushed and defeated, and he himself was killed in the battle. And this is a big defeat for the British. And then the Battle of Fort Oswego and Fort William Henry. The French captured these forts, which the British thought were undefeatable. And the British allies their Indian allies began to wonder if the British could win this war. So the Iroquois are starting to think if they got to change sides. So are some other tribes. But fortunately for Great Britain, William Pitt shows up. He becomes the prime minister, and his first goal is to win the war in North America. And to do this, he sent his best generals, he spent the money, and he sent the supplies. The previous prime minister had been trying to win the war without really putting much effort into it. But Pitt realized if he won this war, he'd take over most of North America for the British Empire. And under the economy of mercantilism, as we all know, that means more money for the crown. The Battle of Louisburg. This was a gigantic French fort that controlled the St. Lawrence River that General Amherst captured in 1758. And this was the most important French fort in Canada and it turned the tide of the battle and of the war, because now the British controlled who could sail up and down the St. Lawrence River, which means the French could not bring supplies in anymore to their army. Once again, Fort Duquesne. The British took control of Fort Duquesne. They retook control in 1758, and they renamed it Fort Pitt, which later becomes Pittsburgh. So if you know where the Pittsburgh Steelers are from, or the Pittsburgh Penguins, or the Pittsburgh Pirates, this is where the Fort Duquesne was and became Fort Pitt. Another British victory. Remember, it's because Pitt had sent his best generals and he spent the money. In the battles of Fort Niagara, Crown Point, and Fort Ticonderoga, the British seized all of them in 1759, which even added more success to the British plate. And now the French are pretty much down to the city of Quebec and Montreal. And then Quebec, which is the most important city on the St. Lawrence River, in the dark of night, the British General Wolfe climbed a very steep cliff, and he surprised the French the next morning when he showed up on the Plains of Abraham and defeated the French, who did not expect this surprise attack, and took the city of Quebec. And this British victory leads to the surrender of Quebec, and basically it leads to the end of the fighting in the war, and now it's time for the peacemakers to meet and do a treaty. So it's just a little map. This illustration is also in your textbook, showing how the British captured Louisbourg and then went down from both directions to capture Quebec. They captured Montreal. All these great victories the British had up here in northern United States. And here's Fort Duquesne out here, if you want to know where it was. Down here at the bottom is Fort Necessity, Washington's defeat, but later on, the win at Fort Duquesne. Now, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763. Notice it's about 4 years later, but things move slower once the fighting starts, because they have to negotiate new boundaries. And this treaty marked the end of French power in North America. They gave up all of their land in North America. The British gained Canada and all the French lands east of the Mississippi, except for New Orleans, which went over to the Spanish. The French kept some islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. I don't know why. They can't do anything with them. They kept some sugar-growing islands in the West Indies. That was important to them. Spain gave up Florida to Britain. Let me go back for a minute so you can see that. Spain gave up Florida to Great Britain. And Spain received New Orleans and all the French land west of the Mississippi. So if you look at the map now, and of course the Spanish kept their empire in Central and South America. They'd picked the right side to fight on. So if you look at the map now, up here where it says British territory, that used to be all French. All this light purple was all the French territory. Now it's all British. And all this yellow along the Missouri, Mississippi used to be French, where it says Louisiana. Now it's all Spanish. So North America is divided between two people, Spain and Britain. France has some islands down here in the Indies, and that's all they have left. Huge defeat for France. So that concludes my presentation to you on the French and Indian War. Be looking for the review to be posted tomorrow. You'll have 2 days of class time to finish that up, and then we'll be having a quiz. Any questions, be sure to reach out and contact me. Thank you.